Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Pratt, and I'm the Director of Education here at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to the Winifred and Villo Sloan Family Fund for supporting our talks this year. I'd like to acknowledge, first off, that the Erie Canal Museum is itself located on the homeland of the Onondaga Nation, central firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Erie Canal is located on the homelands of all the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk, Oneida, Tuscarora, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca Nations. We recognize the Erie Canal played a major role in devastation of their traditional ways of living, negative effects of which linger to this day. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, we are committed to taking actions as best we can to do our part in addressing these wrongs through education and inclusion. Through efforts like our partnership with the Scano Great Law Peace Center, reinterpretation of our exhibits, and speaking series like this one, offering important first steps in that process. Now, the impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, politically, and artistically. This is still from my old, back when art was our theme. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, our mission is to engage the public in the story of the Erie Canal's transformative impacts on peoples and places in the past, present, and future. One such area where the Erie Canal contributed to these transformations was in the development of a number of reform movements, including the women's rights movement Susan B. Anthony is so closely associated with. This lecture is part of our larger Lunchtime lecture series, held monthly to discuss relevant canal topics with experts in their fields. Our next Lunchtime lecture is July 25th, again at noon, featuring Jeff Paston, who will be discussing the canal's great competitor, the New York Central Railroad. We also have deeper dives in the evenings once a month. Our next scheduled deeper dive is July 9th at 6 p.m. and will feature the author of Heaven's Ditch, God, Gold, and Murder on the Erie Canal, Jack Kelly, discussing how the canal impacted religion and politics nationally. Jack will be streaming in for that talk, but you're welcome to join us here that evening at the museum, as it will coincide with the 750 riders on the Cycle of the Erie Canal tour, visiting Syracuse, and as we're projecting it live, we'll also be offering refreshments. But now, on to today's main event. Allison Hinman is the Deputy Director at the National Susan B. Anthony Museum and House. Previously, she served as the Assistant Director of Development at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, and as Director of Development at the Seward House Museum in Auburn, New York. Allison earned an MA in Museum Studies, good MA to have, and an MA in Arts Leadership Administration, also a good one, but yeah, I'm a Museum Studies fan, from Syracuse University. She is also currently a member of the Rochester Preservation Board and an adjunct professor at SUNY Oswego. Please join me in welcoming Allison Hinman. Look at that. I made sure it worked before you tried it.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. Again, I'm Allison. I'm really thrilled to be back in Syracuse, and thank you to the Erie Canal Museum for inviting me to speak today. Susan B. Anthony does have quite a few connections to the Erie Canal. The first being that when her family moved from Battenville, New York, traveled along the Erie Canal to settle in Rochester, and you will actually see the first house that they settle in Rochester in just a few slides. But today's focus is going to be on how various abolition and women's rights meetings and conventions are received in towns and cities throughout New York State. Historically, we've talked about New York, Central and Western New York being the burned over district, and a lot of social movements came out of these regions, and I think there's been an assumption that New York State was extremely progressive, and they can be, but there were also a lot of towns and cities that were not open to hearing what Susan B. Anthony and so many others were interested in changing. So I have some letters and some other direct quotes that I'll be reading from my slides that I think are particularly interesting. So I started off thinking about this talk and saying, where do I even start? So I have selected just a few dates that happened statewide, but also nationally. And I also want to recognize there's a lot of things that are not included. In this timeline, there are a lot of significant dates that are happening nationally and statewide, but I think it's important to acknowledge some of these things to address some of the context that I'm going to share with you today. So I have a map of New York State up here from the 1850s, but also acknowledging the Erie Canal in 1817 is established, and then New York State abolished slavery in 1827. Seneca Falls Convention is not the first time that the ideas surrounding equality for women is shared, but it is one of the first formalized moments in history where you have about 300 people that are going to gather to discuss these ideas. Susan B. Anthony is also not there. She has often been placed there in history. She was still teaching out in Canajoharie. And so when the convention makes its way to Rochester a few weeks later, her father, mother, and sister will sign the Declaration of Sentiments that was presented at the Seneca Falls Convention. And she always said that she was very proud of that. So she'll settle in Rochester in the 1850s, more permanently. And so I've got an image here of a young Susan B. Anthony, and we don't often see too many younger images of her, but she is going to use photography to help promote the women's movement. She and Frederick Douglass are both very conscious of how they present themselves publicly. So Susan B. Anthony, you often see that profile view, though we do have a few images of her looking directly at the camera. But just to give you a basic overview of the causes that she cares about, one of the first social movements that she's involved in is temperance. However, she actually was advocating for equal pay for women in education. Long before that, she would start teaching at the age of 15, where she was making about $2 a week, and male teachers were making $10 to $15 a week. And growing up, she learned from her father that when you see something that's not fair, you change it. And that's exactly what she looked to do while she was teaching. Is if women are doing the same jobs as men, they should be paid the same. So she would advocate around New York State for women to be paid the same as men in education, and is unsuccessful in creating that change. But the temperance movement is something she and her family were involved in. And this is one of the first real efforts to create change that will benefit women and children. A lot of times men's wages were even supplemented with whiskey at that time, and women had no control over any of the money within the household. So this is an effort to ask men from refraining from drinking, and so that money would be spent at home on family and care. The abolition movement is something that they will become heavily involved in and will be a main topic of discussion today, as well as women's rights. And I separated women's rights from suffrage because there were a lot of other things besides the vote that they were looking to change at that time. So Susan B. Anthony in the 1850s is going to become a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. When she first moves to Rochester, one of the first people that she will meet is Frederick Douglass. I have a picture of him on the screen. She was about 27 years old when she met him, and he was about 29 years old. And I think we often think of them as much older individuals, but they worked together for decades to create change in the 19th century. And the two of them will actually start traveling together in support of the abolition movement. Now, Frederick Douglass is the most sought after abolition speaker. Both of them are members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in the 1830s, and Susan B. Anthony will become an agent for that organization in the 1850s. And that's where she'll start traveling around, making speeches, passing out pamphlets. And Frederick Douglass is the most sought after speaker for this organization. 1,000 people would turn up to hear what he has to say, and he would use his own story of enslavement to hopefully persuade other people to join this cause and to work to end slavery immediately in the United States. So here's an image of the farmhouse that the Anthony family will first move to in Rochester. And again, they traveled along the Erie Canal to settle there. And this house was located where the airport is located today. So unfortunately, it no longer exists. But it's here that the Anthony family is going to open up their home to abolition meetings. They are going to welcome Frederick Douglass. That's how Susan B. Anthony will be introduced to him. He is attending meetings at the Anthony's farmhouse, and it's through her father, Daniel, that she is encouraged to go and meet with him. But you also have John Brown, William Lloyd Garrison, Douglass's wife, Anna Murray, and their children that are all coming to visit. And Susan B. Anthony will remark, actually, I believe it's the Post Standard in 1903, she will say their happiest Sundays were when Douglass and his family would visit. She talks about him being a jolly fellow, which I really appreciate that she included, because both she and Douglass have really wonderful senses of humor, but we often get focused on the work and the change that they're trying to create. And she also talks about him always bringing the violin along. So the Douglass family is interacting with the Anthonys quite regularly. And again, I mentioned John Brown is visiting, as well as William Lloyd Garrison, and across the street from Rhoda DeGarmo, who is another abolitionist and women's rights activist, is opening up her house as a station on the Underground Railroad. So Susan B. Anthony makes an entry in a diary that she had made sure all the hay had gotten in the barn, all of that work had been done, but then also said that she fitted out a fugitive through the help of Harriet Tubman. And so we know that they were interacting as well. And while abolition is a main focus, the women's movement is also picking up some speed and getting some traction. But you have the Married Women's Property Act that's enacted in New York State in 1848, which is addressing property rights for women. Frances Seward, I'll pull from my Seward history, will benefit from the Married Women's Property Act. When her father dies, the house transfers to her, not her husband, William Seward. And so the Married Women's Property Act entitled married women and widows to certain property ownership. And so Susan B. Anthony in this quote is reflecting on the experiences that women are having. And I really love this statement. She says, "Women must have a purse of her own. And how can this be so long as the wife is denied the right of her individual and joint earnings?" Reflections like these cause me to see and really feel that there was no true freedom for women without the possession of all her property rights. This demand must be made by petitions to the legislature. So when she's talking about individual and joint earnings, if you were a woman that was working that looked like Susan B. Anthony and was married, your wages were going directly to your husband and you had no legal claim to them. You also had no legal claim to your children. So if your husband left, he could take them and there was nothing that you could do about it. So all of these things are factoring into some of their thoughts about how to approach women's rights and also approach abolition. So some of you may be familiar with this image. This is located right in Auburn, New York on Genesee Street. This is the Cayuga County Courthouse. And Susan B. Anthony in 1855 is going to reach out to Martha Coffin Wright, who was one of the organizers of that Women's Rights Convention in 1848 that was working with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And Susan B. Anthony is going to reach out to her because it is time to have a women's rights meeting in Cayuga County. And Martha was actually concerned that there would be poor attendance, but she will write to her sister Lucretia and say, "There was quite a tolerable audience, and they listened with apparent interest to the B. Anthony's hard facts." And she referred to Susan B. Anthony as Banthony. So when you hear me say that, that is how Martha Coffin referred to her. And the more polished periods of Mrs. Stanton. "I have heard so often that the law classes women with children and idiots and allows 6 spoons and etc. to widows, and that the man has custody of the wife, and that the men who enforce the laws are mean men, but not meaner than the laws. That it is not quite so fresh when I first listened to it, but I was glad for it to be driven in and clinched in the Banthony's hammer and anvil style for the benefit of those to whom it was new." So you'll hear a little bit later on, Cayuga County isn't as receptive to women gaining the vote, but well received in 1855. Cayuga County and Auburn is operating also in a number of capacities as stations on the Underground Railroad. Martha Coffin Wright's home on Genesee Street would also serve as a stop on the Underground Railroad. So we're headed now to Syracuse, New York, and instead of having a women's movement, women's meeting, we are going to have an abolition convention. We're now moving into 1861. Abraham Lincoln has just been elected president of the United States. And Susan B. Anthony is traveling with Samuel J. May, who is an abolitionist. And May's thoughts about hosting abolition conventions is that they are to go forward and leave the responsibility of free speech or its suppression with the people of the places that they visit. So they are not sure what the reception will be when they visit. And Susan B. Anthony will write to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and say, poor dear Mr. May's philosophy is just the one to best please his satanic majesty, and we can even spare the test for Syracuse. No, that city of loudest pretensions must be put to the test. So what they find when they come to Syracuse is that Syracuse proved to be the worst of the places they stopped when they hosted abolition meetings. Syracuse citizens rioted and actually stopped the meeting. The mob then paraded through the streets with effigies of May and Susan B. Anthony in the act of sexual intercourse, and Susan B. Anthony was then hung in effigy. So this is now creating some concern around the state for how they're going to be received when they start doing more traveling and hosting more conventions. So they're going to head back west and they're going to stop in Buffalo. And Susan B. Anthony is writing to Martha Coffin Wright, who again is living in Auburn, New York. And she said, here we are, Mrs. Stanton Green and I, alive after the Buffalo mob. I have forgotten whether I have asked you to have the Auburn Convention published in your weekly papers to date. So send this. We have dispatched notes of the Buffalo riot to Tribune, Standard, and Liberator, and hope some of them will get out to the world. There was a more determined union to put down a speech, not to the mind of the masses, but we must face it through. Mrs. Stanton's pen is scratching a free speech. She is getting a grand speech, and we are doing nicely. Only want to the faces of Powell and May. Goodbye. P.S. Your folks don't get up a scare about the hall they have at Utica and Rochester, but we shall go through. So Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, while they're traveling around supporting the abolition conventions, recognize that their lives are on the line. They are feeling, though, that the causes that they're supporting are worth it. Susan B. Anthony will talk about times when they are pelted with rotten fruits and vegetables. You will have people that will just scream and shout to try to drown out their voices and make sure that they can't be heard. And she also talks about a time when people showed up with knives in the crowd. So if it's cold, and unlike today, it's very hot, but if it's cold and you're having a convention in a closed space, someone might also throw peppercorn in your pot-bellied stove there. That acted like a tear gas to clear the room. So people were doing a lot of different things to make sure that these messages couldn't get heard. So we're now back in Auburn for a convention in 1861. So right in line, Buffalo happened January 7th. They're back in Auburn on January 31st and February 1st. And here I have images of Martha Coffin Wright. You've got one of Susan B. Anthony sitting in front of her desk, and in looking closer at that picture, that's probably pretty reflective of what her desk looked like most of the time. There's quite a bit behind her. Not only is she working for the abolition movement, but the women's rights movement, and Susan used to write about 100 letters a week to try to make sure that she's engaging as many people as possible in these various causes. And then we have an image of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is primarily in Seneca Falls, so she will travel a little bit, but the fact that she's a mother keeps her at home a little bit more than Susan B. Anthony, who traveled anywhere from 8,000 to 13,000 miles a year, especially when the train expands west, she's on it. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to organize a tour of abolition speakers, and Martha Coffin Wright is going to agree to preside as president over the two that are taking place in Auburn, and she'll also arrange the conventions. There were concerns that they would be disrupted by angry mobs. However, they are going to proceed with this convention as planned. And Martha Coffin Wright is going to write to her daughter, "This will be my busy week, getting notices for the convention posted, putting one in the dailies, seeing the mayor to get him to send policemen to the hall, and entertaining our guests. Our anti-slavery convention here begins tomorrow afternoon and lasts through Friday afternoon and evening. That is, if it is not broken up by a mob as it was in Syracuse yesterday and had been in several other places. I have taken such precautions as I could in arranging for the convention, and then if it is disturbed, the responsibility must rest on our public men who are continually preaching of compromise and concession toward our Southern brethren. We are expecting Reverend Bariah Green, Samuel J. May, Aaron M. Powell, Mrs. Stanton, and S.B. Anthony tomorrow morning." So according to the papers after that convention, there was a mob of 150 men that broke up the meeting, and an area newspaper reported that in the evening, a motley crowd of rowdies assembled and broke up the meeting, taking possession of the room and organizing a meeting of their own, and passed the same resolutions adopted by the Syracuse mob meeting. Susan B. Anthony is going to have a response to this. Apparently, as the mob is taking over the room, she will lean over and say, "Why, boys, you're nothing but a baby mob. You ought to go to Syracuse and learn how to do it, and also learn how to get before the grand jury." So the abolitionists will actually shift their meeting to Martha Coffin Wright's house. Her husband David, she and David open up their home so that they can continue. And the paper reported that abolitionists held a meeting at the dwelling of a citizen of Auburn where they were not molested. And so that dwelling was Martha Coffin and her husband David's. They're still not stopping. They are going to proceed on. So we have Frederick Douglass, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony that are going to speak at the convention in Albany, New York, and they're there on February 4th and 5th. I know I've thrown around a lot of dates. This just gives you a sense of how quickly they are moving from one place to the next. And it's through the network that they've established through the American Anti-Slavery Society and the Women's Network that helps make all of this work possible, as well as Susan B. Anthony's constant correspondence and organizing skills. So on February 4th and 5th, they head to Albany, and Martha Coffin Wright is again going to serve as the convention's president. Lucretia Mott, Frederick Douglass, and Susan B. Anthony are all going to speak. In anticipation of mob violence, there was a large police presence, and the mayor actually sat on stage facing the crowd with a shotgun across his lap. Martha Coffin Wright remembered, "The roughs compelled to sit in the body of the hall, the whole police force in uniform sprinkled among them." And Susan's address read just after the galleries were cleared, there was a sentence about John Brown, which they hissed. The mayor compelled quiet, and she repeated. Another uproar, which was stilled, and I said to her, "Repeat." And she repeated for the third time with better success. So I think history is also starting to look at John Brown quite differently. And how and Susan B. Anthony certainly looks at him differently than even some other abolitionists. He did believe in violence to end abolition, but Susan B. Anthony's own brothers are going to be involved in his work out in Kansas. They'll be a part of Bloody Kansas. They'll enlist in the Union Army, which is rather unusual for two boys that have adopted the Quaker faith. But Susan B. Anthony will even in the guest book in 1904 be making a comment on the day that he had been executed, remembering him for all of his good deeds and his work. So he was someone that the Anthony family really lifted up and felt that he was doing whatever was necessary to end the institution of slavery in the United States. So Martha Coffin Wright did state at this convention that she shall always remember the manly bravery of Frederick Douglass as he stood on the edge of the platform with folded arms and dared the mob to come on as they threatened to attack him. So they're continuing to do this work, even though pretty much every place they're now starting to expect this type of response. So in going back to some of the dates that I had up on that second slide after my title slide, there are some Reconstruction amendments that are going to be implemented. Civil War will end in 1865. You will also have the 13th Amendment passed and ratified in 1865. So slavery has been abolished throughout the United States, though after the Emancipation Proclamation, it takes an entire 2 years for everybody that's enslaved to learn that they are in fact free, which is why Juneteenth has been commemorated. And Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass, Lucretia Mott, Martha Coffin Wright, they are all going to join this organization called the American Equal Rights Association. Susan B. Anthony is actually going to make the first motion and present the name. Martha Coffin Wright will be the person that will second that. And the goal of the American Equal Rights Association was to secure universal suffrage. You will then have the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868. It was a direct response to the treatment of those that were formerly enslaved. It also addressed citizen rights and equal protection under the law. However, it will have the word male in the second section. So it is not addressing citizenship for all. It is addressing male citizenship. And so you have members of the American Equal Rights Association that's a little bit concerned about this because you have men and women that have come together for the first time with a unified voice, advocating for suffrage for those that currently don't have it. And so you will then have the women's movement that's been united under this organization think, well, we can get included in this 15th Amendment that's been proposed. Let's have 2 more words added to that, and sex. So the 15th Amendment would say that you cannot be denied the right to vote based on race or previous servitude. And so Black men could now vote. However, they wanted and sex included so that it would allow women to vote as well, all women to vote. And so you're going to have the American Equal Rights Association not be sure how to proceed with this. And the organization is actually going to collapse because you had members that were willing to compromise, and you had a lot of women saying, wait a minute, the goal was for all of us to do this together. If we stick together, it'll be quicker for us to all get this right. And you have other men within the organization and women that are saying, well, let's take what's being offered now and then continue to do the work together. And so there will be a debate. Susan B. Anthony will directly challenge Frederick Douglass as to why women cannot be included. And he basically says if women are included, it wouldn't pass. We'd be asking for too much. He also talks about how necessary and urgent it is for Black men to have the vote because of the horrors and violence that they are experiencing. He also feels that this is the first time that 3 amendments have been passed almost consecutively in 60 years. And so isn't it reasonable to think that there could be a 16th Amendment and it could be for women and that Black men would be instrumental in making that possible? Bottom line, he and Susan B. Anthony are not going to agree about how to move forward. And the American Equal Rights Association is going to collapse, and the women's movement that was unified under this organization is going to split. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are going to openly oppose the 15th Amendment because it did not include all women. They will form the National Women's Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone and her husband will form another organization called the American Women's Suffrage Association. They will support the 15th Amendment, and then they will go state by state to get women the right to vote. And then you have women of color that have been completely excluded from these discussions. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper will enter the debate and say, you white women here speak of rights, I speak of wrongs, reminding them that they have ignored what Black women have experienced in the 19th century. So Some Black women will support the American Women's Suffrage Association. Some will support Susan B. Anthony's National Women's Suffrage Association. And then a large number of them say neither of these groups is supporting or thinking about my needs. So they organize themselves. So you have three groups of people that now all want women to vote, but they aren't going to work together because of the differences, which also, with these groups remaining divided, allows racism and religion to play its role in keeping people separate. And so you're going to have a lot of women left frustrated, and they are going to start advocating for women to get the vote. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton still want all of the things that were listed in the Declaration of Sentiments, like right to own property, right to higher education, divorce, keep your own wages, be paid the same as men, be able to do professional work, so have the same jobs as men. But in 1860 in New York State, they expanded that Married Women's Property Act to include having custody of your own children and keeping your own wages. But by 1862, New York State legislature repealed those freedoms. And so what that reinforced to them is that without the vote, there's no point in advocating for all of those things because women will just have the same battles over and over again. They need a way to make sure that any legislation that benefits women can be kept in place. And that's with the vote. And so you're going to have women test previous legislation because Susan B. Anthony's organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association, is now thinking it's going to take too long to have a new amendment put in place that would grant women the vote. So let's revisit some previous legislation and see if there are any loopholes. And they'll revisit that 14th Amendment and say that based on the statement that if you're born in the United States, you are a natural born citizen and citizenship protects your rights, liberties, and freedoms. They'll ignore the section that has the word male but under that statement, you would think women should be included in that, and that maybe that includes the vote. Maybe they don't need another amendment. And so Susan B. Anthony will attempt to register to vote, and she actually does that successfully. You have men around the country that are going to try this. Sojourner Truth will be turned away in Michigan, but Susan in Rochester was very successful. And she will not only register to vote, but cast a vote in a presidential election in 1872. She'll vote for Grant. And she'll then write to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and say, I've been and gone and done it, positively voted, and I hope you did too. But she was expecting that she would be stopped along the way and was ready to have a case go to trial. She does all of these things successfully until November 18th. There's a knock on the front door of her house in Rochester at 17 Madison Street, and there's a U.S. Deputy Marshal that's there to place her, well, not place her under arrest. He's issuing a warrant for her arrest because he's basically going to tell her, when you get a chance, go on down to the courthouse. He had never arrested a woman before and was looking to avoid a spectacle, and that's exactly what she wanted. So she will insist on being handcuffed and escorted. He didn't bring handcuffs with him, but he does end up escorting her down to the police station, and a trial date is set. And she is not going to think that she is given a legal trial. Matilda Jocelyn Gage is going to come into Rochester, and she will help Susan B. Anthony write a speech called "Is It a Crime for a U.S. Citizen to Vote?" And unfortunately, she is found guilty for voting as a woman. The judge will inform the jury of the verdict. He will dismiss them, not allow them to deliberate, and then share what the verdict is and fine her $100 plus some court fees. She'll deliver a pretty scathing speech, and she'll also keep a trial transcript copy with her throughout the rest of her days to show how illegal and unfair her trial is. She'll refuse to pay her fine. She'll say, I'll never pay $1 of this unjust penalty, and she doesn't, still marked unpaid in the court records. But she is going to argue that she's done nothing wrong. She used her rights as a citizen of the United States and was not given a fair or legal trial. One of the points that she'll make is that she's not given a trial by jury, not allowing them to deliberate and dismissing them. They're not able to pass any type of judgment. And so I really like this quote from her where she's using dictionary definitions and saying that a citizen is a person in the United States entitled to vote and hold office. And this is my favorite part. The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe that any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they are not. Being persons, then, women are citizens, and no state has the right to make any law or enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. So though the women's movement isn't experiencing the same type of violence that the abolition movement is experiencing, they are experiencing a lot of ridicule. And so in the next slide, this is one of the cartoons that we use on tour at the museum. So this is printed around the time of Susan B. Anthony's trial. It's titled The Woman Who Dared. And there's a lot to unpack in this cartoon. You've got Susan B. Anthony standing out in front alone. Some students recently pointed out to me that the artist made her look like she had a mustache. And I had not noticed that before. And they also have her not even in bloomers, but what you're seeing is her in her undergarments. The cartoonist is looking to embarrass her. On her feet is one women's shoe and one male shoe. And then behind her, there's a lot going on. You have two men on the side. One is holding a baby. The other is holding a purse. And to the other side of her, there's a woman dressed in some type of military uniform or police officer outfit. So who will hold the babies when the women take our jobs? If women enter the workforce and do the same jobs as men, men will be stuck raising the children, and basically the whole world will turn upside down. And behind her, there is a group of women holding protest signs, and the artist has made them look rather aggressive and angry. Those are your suffragists. Those are women like Susan B. Anthony that want the right to vote. There's a larger group to the other side of her, and those women are dressed very properly, look very calm and composed. Those are your anti-suffragists. So those are your women that don't want women to vote. So clearly the Daily Graphic is not a pro-suffrage magazine, but these are the types of things that Susan B. Anthony and other women were subjected to all the time. They weren't taken very seriously. They were often made fun of, and though it isn't violence, it's still not very welcoming, especially when they're going into different communities. And Susan B. Anthony does have a really interesting relationship with the press. She doesn't believe in good or bad press. She just believes in keeping people talking. It's an opportunity to share your perspective if something else is printed. So I liked this quote too, because this also shows that there is some positivity around some of these movements. So you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing to the editor of the Index, and she said, "We had a large and enthusiastic convention, the last session in Corinthian Hall, continuing until 11 o'clock at night, although the heat was almost unendurable. One of the marked features of this convention was the very respectful and complimentary tone of the entire press of the city of Rochester." So you can see that there's a little bit of surprise in that statement. And this was an excerpt from a letter on July 22nd in 1878. And I have an image of what was Corinthian Hall in Rochester. And though women were often subjected to ridicule, the women's movement did receive some positive press and support. Susan B. Anthony, though is often perceived in a negative light in the press, had some people, some reporters that were on her side. She always looked to have an opportunity to tell her side of the story first. I also really liked this excerpt here, and it talks about Susan B. Anthony has been traveling, and there's a group of people that are working for the women's cause. They've presented her with flowers, and they're basically thanking her for all of the things that she's endured on behalf of the cause. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton is writing this to Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and she's saying, "Friends, I have no words to express my gratitude for this marked attention. I have so long been the target for criticism and ridicule of our cause. I am so unused to praise and compliment that I stand before you surprised and disarmed." Susan B. Anthony, before she uttered that statement, Stanton wrote to Gage that she actually stood there in silence with everyone in the room kind of feeling the weight of that emotion, because so often it is a more negative or hostile experience that they're having when they are traveling, especially across New York State. So the national headquarters, so the movement that split, where you have the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, is finally going to merge in 1890 and become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And there's significant compromises that are made on behalf of both organizations. And Susan B. Anthony is going to serve as one of its presidents in the 1890s. So the women's movement national headquarters will move to 17 Madison Street. Susan and her sister Mary will actually make a renovation to their house and add a third floor so that they can accommodate all of the women that are coming and doing the work, that are traveling in from all different states. So pictured here is an image of the attic with Susan B. Anthony in the corner, and Ida Houston Harper is sitting next to her. Some significant works were written in that attic, including The History of Women's Suffrage by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. The other thing I like is you see women working in the background. I mentioned earlier, Susan wrote about 100 letters a week. As she's getting older, she has had some health setbacks that don't make that possible, but she has 3 secretaries in her employment at that time. So she is able to dictate and they type up what she has to say. She can sign a quick signature and out the door it goes. And another way that she's saving some money for the movement is she became postmaster in Rochester. So she would get free postage. And that was one of the ways that she would save some money for the movement. But you have women from all across the US that are stopping and staying in this house. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton are staying there, but you also have Reverend Anna Howard Shaw. You have Ida B. Wells Barnett that will stay there multiple times, and many, many others. Susan B. Anthony will pass away in 1906 on March 13th at 86 years old, and she has not lived to see women legally get the vote. She does know that it will happen. She'll make a famous failure is impossible speech in Baltimore, Maryland, looking around the room at about 1,000 women and recognizing that they are not defeated, even though Congress just turned down what is now the 19th Amendment. And so she recognizes that if the women continue to do the work, eventually they will have the vote. And so I've included some images of some of the women that carried on with the work. We have Ida B. Wells Barnett, Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, Hester Jeffrey, and then Carrie Chapman Catt, who Susan B. Anthony basically handpicked to carry on with that work. So, I wanted to go back. New York State will be the 14th state to grant women the right to vote in 1917. However, Albany, Rochester, and other cities did not vote in favor of women getting the right to vote. So even though you have Susan B. Anthony's hometown being Rochester, New York, that was something that they were not in support of. And the work continued, 1917 for New York, but it's not the 19th Amendment isn't ratified until 1920, which granted women the right to vote. And even though on paper that's what it says, whether or not someone actually had access to the polls is another discussion. And Susan B. Anthony also understood that just getting the right to vote doesn't mean that everything is fixed. There was still more work to do. And so the work was really just beginning for women, with the vote being granted in 1920 nationwide. Any questions about anything that I've talked about today?
That's the same still the age.
That was living right here in Fayetteville. Yes. Yes.
I also prefer to her banqueting, but I had thought it came from Elizabeth Cady Stanton's children. I didn't know.
Yeah, it's Martha Coffin Wright that is going to refer to her as Banthony.
But my real question is, the B stands for Brownell.
Brownell.
And where does that come from?
It is a family name. And I believe it's something she adopts in her teens when middle names are becoming popular. Yes.
I was just wondering if I read one letter from 1861 correctly about the Buffalo riots. It's like, sounds like there was a riot in like every major town, even in Rochester as well. Okay.
Yeah, there's those were just a few that some of them are very long, some of the letters, and recounts of the activity that happened, but they continued to persevere. They knew that the work that they were doing was important, but it certainly wasn't comforting knowing that you're probably going to meet resistance when you're headed to that next city or town.
Do we know, the sticking here at the end, especially in the last slide, another famous, Rochester radical reformers, Emma Goldman, did they ever interact at all, or?
I don't know. I don't know anything about Emma Goldman. I'm so sorry. Chances are if they were around at the same time, yeah. Oh.
We also have a question on Sue.
Okay.
What about the estrangement in which we engage in? Anthony seemed to minimize his Gage contributions, especially in later history of women's suffrage.
So I don't have a ton of detail about that. I do know that, and I'm not sure, but I've done a little reading about this. So Susan believed that everybody should have the right to vote, and my understanding was that there were certain religious groups that Gage was concerned about having access to the polls, and Anthony's comment was, this has to be a right for everybody. So I was reading correspondence and prepping for this, that they're communicating via letters through the 1880s and maybe into the 90s. So I know that there was still a connection, but she is one of the authors listed on the first 3 volumes of History of Women's Suffrage that covers right through 1906. Volume 4 through 6 will cover 1906 through 1920. So I don't have enough information on that to give a solid answer.
So obviously their families supporting these efforts, we were any benefactors, you have to travel quite a bit.
Right, so for those of you on Zoom, the question was, were there any benefactors? Susan B. Anthony is always looking for people to make donations. There's actually a time she's stuck out west, trying to head to Chicago, and she's stuck for 3 days on a train because the snow was so heavy, and she's going to use that as an opportunity to go car to car to see if anybody's willing to support the cause. If they weren't necessarily willing to support women's suffrage, she always had something else that maybe that they could support as well. So she is a really gifted organizer, fundraiser, and there were people that said no. And she also took money from a man named George Francis Train that was extremely controversial. He was a known racist, to get her newspaper, The Revolution, up and running, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And that really tarnishes her reputation with those that she had been working alongside for decades. But she does go into debt with that paper because as an unmarried woman, she could sign a legal document. Stanton as a married woman could not. And Train will go to Europe. So she will have about $10,000 worth of debt to pay back. So some of her speaker's fees went to pay that off. She'll use it as an example to prove that women can manage finances and pay back debt. But so she does take money from a number of people, but they're always looking to receive more to keep the movement up and running. And actually, when the house was being restored, one of the contractors found a letter that had dropped between the wall and the stairs, and there was actually a check in there to support the cause that had never been cashed. Any other questions? Well, thank you all so much.